Mr. Zimmerman, please stand up for just one moment, sir.
Yes, sir.
I have been informed by counsel that the testimony of Dr. DeMeo is going to be carved down. And I don't want to know what the discussions were. I just want to know, did you have discussions with Mr. O'Mara about Dr. DeMeo's testimony?
Yes, sir.
And based upon those discussions, do you agree with his representation that he is not going to ask certain area topics from Dr. DeMeo?
Yes, sir.
And that is your decision that you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Has anybody promised you anything to get you to make that decision?
No, Your Honor.
Has anybody threatened you?
No, Your Honor.
Are you doing so freely and voluntarily?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you very much. Are we ready to bring the jury in?
Yes, Your Honor. No, not quite. It's very close.
Well, how close are we?
Would like to have the physical exhibits in the courtroom, Your Honor. The shirts that have been cased.
Okay, if you'll please open the clerk, please open the evidence locker door and please get out whatever you think you're going to need. Can somebody from the defense please go in there and see what you need? Are we now ready to bring the jury in?
Yes, we are.
State?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. Let's bring the jury in. Lisa?
Jury's present, Your Honor.
Please be seated. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I apologize for keeping you sitting back there, but we have been busy working here in the courtroom. During the overnight, I'm going to ask you my questions. If your answer is yes to any of the questions, please raise your hand. During the overnight recess, did any of you have any discussions amongst yourselves or with anybody else about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you use any type of an electronic device to go on the internet to do independent research about the case, people, places, things, or terminology? No hands are being raised. And finally, did any of you read or create any emails, text messages, Twitters, tweets, blogs, or social networking pages about the case? No hands are being raised. Thank you very much. Mr. West, call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Vincent DeMaio.
Do you solemnly swear affirm the testimony presented will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Morning. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning.
If you would, please state your name.
My name is Dr. Vincent J.M. DeMaio.
And would you spell your last name, please?
Capital D, small I, a space, capital M, A-I-O.
Thank you, Dr. DeMaio. And what is your profession, please?
I'm a physician, presently employed in the private practice of forensic pathology.
Do you hold a degree in medicine?
Yes, sir. I obtained my M degree from the State University of New York Downstate Medical Center back in 1965.
And Dr. DeMaio, would you please outline for the jury and the court your educational background then beginning at medical school?
Okay. As I said, I graduated medical school in 1965. I then did a one-year internship in pathology at Duke Hospital in Durham, North Carolina. From there, I did a 3-year residency in anatomical and clinical pathology at the State University Downstate Medical Center Hospital. Following that, I did a 1-year fellowship in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland. After successfully completing the 3 residency programs, I took my specialty board exams and was certified as a specialist in the fields of anatomical pathology, clinical pathology, and forensic pathology.
Is that board certification? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, a board certification means that you've successfully completed a number of years of training in a subspecialty of medicine, and then you have taken a written and practical exam and passed the exam. And then you are certified and you're recognized by other physicians as a specialist in these areas of medicine.
Dr. DeMaio, you mentioned anatomical, clinical, forensic pathology. Let's start first with what is pathology, and then maybe some more detail about those other areas.
Well, pathology is a branch of medicine concerned with the study and diagnosis of diseases. Anatomical pathologists generally work in hospitals, and they examine tissue that is removed from somebody. If you had a mole removed from your skin, you had a breast biopsy, or some tissue, from inside your body or part of an organ removed, this is examined by a pathologist who then tells your physician what the disease is and if it's there, the extent of the disease, and then he tells you what the diagnosis is. Pathologists are generally doctors. You won't contact them because your physician has contact with them, and that's an anatomical. The clinical pathologist is concerned with the laboratory studies done on patients in a hospital. If you've had a blood test, a urine test, all of those are done in clinical pathology laboratories. The forensic pathologist is concerned more with the application of the medical sciences to problems in the law. Most forensic pathologists function as medical examiners. That is, they determine the cause of death, what killed the person, and the manner of death, how it came about, in individuals who are thought to have died of violence, such as accidents, suicides, or homicides, or who've died suddenly and unexpectedly, and the exact cause of death is not known. At that time, they may elect to perform an autopsy to make such determinations. And then, based on the circumstances surrounding the death, the autopsy findings and tests done, they'll make a determination as to cause of death, what killed you, and manner of death, how it came about.
Let's talk for a moment about the professional positions that you've held following the training that you've outlined at this point.
I'm sorry, but I'm having trouble hearing you. I apologize. My ears are getting a little less sensitive.
Let me touch this and see if it's... I'm happy to speak up, Judge. I think I was facing away, but of course, if Dr. DeMaio prefers some assistance.
We can make him available in case you need some assistance.
Sure. Apparently, we don't have a PA system in the courtroom that amplifies my voice, so I'll just try to be more careful to speak up. And
yes, sir.
So, following the training that you've outlined, would you please give us an idea then of the professional positions that you've held?
Yes, sir. After I completed my training, I went into the Army for 2 years. I was a major assigned to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C. It was on the Walter Reed campus. For the first year, I was chief of the medical legal section. For the second year, I was chief of the wound ballistics section. Following this, I moved to Dallas, Texas, was a medical examiner there from the summer of 1972 till the end of February in 1981. In 1981, I became chief medical examiner of Bexar County, Texas. And for the transcriber, Bexar is spelled B-E-X-A-R, the X is silent. So I was chief medical examiner there. The major city is San Antonio, which I'll give a plug. It's the 7th largest city in the United States, and a beautiful place to live. So I was chief medical examiner there from March 1st, 1981, until I retired December the 31st, 2006. For 16 of the years I was there, I was also in charge of the crime laboratory. I then retired and I went into the complete private practice of forensic pathologist, which I have been doing since then. I'm also the editor of the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology, which is an international journal of forensic medicine. And I'm chairman of the Texas Forensic Science Commission, which is a state agency charged with, I guess you could say, monitoring the practices of crime labs in the state of Texas.
Dr. DeMaio, you did mention that you were the director of the Bexar County Crime Lab for about 16 years. Could you Expand on that a little bit. What was your role more specifically, and what did the lab do?
Well, essentially, I established it. The police department had the crime lab. The county took over when I came there. It started out as just firearms and basic serology and document examination. And then we were one of the first laboratories west of Mississippi to establish a DNA laboratory. And it just does the usual things, you know, drug identification, DNA, trace evidence.
Did some of that work include knowing how to package evidence that may have biological or perhaps DNA evidence?
Well, yes, I mean that, but usually you just teach the forensic pathologists. They know that, because even if they have no association with a crime laboratory, that you have to, there's techniques for handling trace evidence, you know, in collection, establishing a chain of evidence, and packaging. So if you
is it well known that there are certain requirements when you are packaging evidence that may contain biological samples, blood, other fluids that may have DNA that are wet?
Yes, you have to dry out the material and then package each item individually in paper. Because if you don't let it dry out, and especially if you put it in plastic containers, the bacteria just love that, and they begin multiplying, and then you get mold, and it just stinks to high heaven, and everything deteriorates.
So that's something that's well known in the forensic pathology community?
Oh yeah, that's standard practice.
It's been well known for a while?
Yeah, I'd say maybe about 30 years that I know.
Back to the work that you have done with the group that monitors forensic labs. I think you said you were involved.
Oh, Texas Forensic Science Commission.
Yes.
Yeah.
What is that work, and what does that involve insofar as you and other pathologists?
Okay, essentially it's a government agency, and if there are problems, somebody thinks there's a problem with a crime laboratory, either an individual in it or the whole laboratory, whether their techniques or whether there's that somebody in the lab is doing something wrong, then it's reported to the state agency, and then we investigate it and then issue a report. Actually, most of the problems with the laboratories are actually reported by the laboratories themselves, because they want the test to be done proper. So more than half our investigations are laboratories reporting themselves that there's something wrong with them.
In addition to the professional positions that you've had and talked about, have you also had academic appointments?
Yes, with the University of Texas system, I started out as an assistant professor, then associate professor, and then I ended up as a full professor before I retired.
And in what subject matter, please?
Pathology, specifically forensic pathology.
Have you, in addition to your day-to-day work as a medical examiner and your work at the university as a professor in pathology, have you published any books or articles, scientific articles, in the area of pathology?
Yes, I've published 88 articles in peer-reviewed journals, I think 13 book chapters, and then I've published 4 books. The first book was Gunshot Wounds, which I wrote myself, and it's been published in English, French, and Spanish. Then I wrote a book called Forensic Pathology with my father, who was chief medical examiner of New York City, and he's deceased now. And then the third book was a handbook of forensic pathology, which I wrote with one of my colleagues, Dr. Susanna Dana. And the fourth book is on what's called excited delirium syndrome, in which I wrote, well, The senior author, I'm the junior author of that book. The senior author of that book is my wife, who's a forensic nurse. And so we wrote that book on excited delirium syndrome. That's the last one we've written. So.
Let's talk for a moment about your work in gunshots. That was, I think you said, the first book that you wrote, and has it been updated over time?
There's been 2 editions published, and the 3rd edition is going to the publishers in another week or 2. This week kind of delayed it, but it's going in about 2 weeks, the 3rd edition.
Would you describe for the jury generally the purpose or the focus of that book, if it isn't otherwise self-explanatory by its title?
The book starts out instructing people about firearms, and then it talks about firearms wounds in general, and in rifles and handguns and shotguns, mentions things, how to do an autopsy, how to collect evidence, and what you can do with the analysis.
When you say gunshot wounds, are you talking about how a pathologist could, by looking at a gunshot wound, learn such things as the distance, perhaps, from which the shot was fired?
Right, whether it's a contact or near contact or loose contact or distant wound, range, nature of the weapon, you can tell by the wound in many cases, things like that. And how to describe it and how to document it.
And has that been the sort of work that you've been doing yourself virtually your entire career?
Yes, I have a very strong interest in gunshot wounds.
You also mentioned, Dr. DeMaio, that you've written, I think you said 13 chapters. I take that means in other people's books than your own.
That's correct, sir.
And how does that work? How would you come to write a chapter that someone else would include in one of their books?
They solicit me to write the chapter. They say, would you please write a chapter on this and that in other books.
Are some of those books a more comprehensive look at forensic pathology than maybe what you wrote yourself in your gunshot wound book?
Well, I don't think so. Usually, it depends. The chapters are not all on gunshot wounds. Some of them are like excited delirium or other things as well. Nursing, investigation of nursing home deaths and such.
About how many of those chapters, if you recall, that you wrote for other people's books involved gunshot wounds?
I think about 7.
You also mentioned that you have authored or participated in about 88 peer-reviewed articles. Would you explain to the jury what is a peer-reviewed article?
Essentially, it's a scientific article that is submitted to a journal, and when the journal receives the article, they send it out for other people to review, to essentially give their opinion whether it should be published or not. So it's reviewed by other people, then it comes back to the main editor, and then the editor decides whether to publish or not.
Peers mean other pathologists?
Other pathologists, right.
And if the article is indeed published, does that make it available to other pathologists, other researchers who may want to refer to it in work they're doing, or to perhaps educate themselves as to the body of research out there in a particular subject area?
It is. We have kind of like a central, used to be you looked in the library, but now you go on the computers and you can get into a medical library, and they'll have the articles listed, and usually nowadays you can actually review the article on the computer. But these are, essentially it's a library. So it's, all these things are listed in certain indexes for physicians.
About how many of the articles that you have participated in writing involved gunshot wounds?
I think something like 35, 37, something like that.
Over the entire span of your career, you're talking about the peer review articles, the books, the chapters, and the research that you've done yourself? These events, these writings were developed over the time that you've worked as a forensic pathologist.
Right, over 40 years.
You mentioned that you had worked in Bexar County as the medical examiner from 1981 until the end of 2006. During that time, did you routinely perform autopsies?
Yes, I performed about 9,000 autopsies, and then I reviewed the autopsies that were done under my jurisdiction, and that was about another 27, 28,000. That meant I read the autopsies and said whether I agreed or not. And as I said, the 9,000. I did autopsies until October of the year that I retired.
Would you typically, if involved in a criminal case involving work that you had done, be called by the prosecution?
Yes. Yes. Of course, when I was chief medical examiner, then I would testify in court about the autopsies I did, and the other doctors testified about the autopsies that they did.
Meaning that you had a staff of other forensic pathologists at your medical examiner's office that also performed autopsies?
I had 4 full-time physicians, plus I had 1 training position. Our office, my office, former office, was approved for a program to train fellows in the field of forensic pathology. There's about, I think, 38, 39 offices in the United States approved to train in forensic pathology.
During the time that you were there as a, for lack of a better term, a ballpark idea of how many autopsies the office would do in the course of a year?
Oh, we do 1,400 to 1,500 autopsies, I would say, and then we'd have about another equal number of 1,400 to 1,500 bodies that we elected not to do autopsies, just external exams.
And you would yourself perform autopsies throughout the time that you were there?
Right. I think the last autopsy I did was in October, and then I retired in December. You can't work to the last day because it takes weeks, if not a month or two, to complete all the details of an autopsy. So you have to stop a couple of months before.
Since 1981, when you began your work at the Bexar County Medical Examiner's Office, were you also able to work as a consultant privately in other cases outside Bexar County?
Yes, sir.
And what kind of work would you do in that regard?
Mostly civil cases, and then a few criminal cases. Outside Bexar County, I could testify for the defense as well as for prosecution. So you don't do many private criminal cases, such as like what I'm doing now. I'd run about 2 to 4 years at most.
You have been working as a consultant since the beginning of 2007 then, if I've done the math correctly. Exclusively as a consultant, having retired from the medical examiner's office.
Right, since January of 2007.
In other words, you've been in private practice as a consultant since January of 2007.
Yes, sir.
And the majority of your work is in connection with civil cases?
Yes, sir.
Does that sometimes still include gunshot injuries, though?
Yes, usually it's cases, insurance cases involving alleged suicides, whether a case is suicide or not. Occasionally you'll get a case of accidental discharge to maybe a defect in the firearm.
You mentioned that you were in the military. Did you do any research when you were in the military?
Yes, so that's when I started my firearms research. We did study the mechanisms of firearms and also review gunshot wound cases. We had with microflash and high-speed photography. You see pictures occasionally of like a gun going off and a bullet in the air or something. That's the type of photography we did. But we would shoot into ordnance gelatin to evaluate different types of ammunition and how effective it was. We also, when I was in charge of the wound ballistic section, I also had what was called the wound met study. And this was a study done in Vietnam, and photographs of individuals who had been injured or killed by different type weapons, and there was an attempt to study the effectiveness of these studies. It was very exciting. All I remember now, we had 50,000 35 millimeter slides in this, and then we had all the cases with it.
You mentioned microphotography and began to explain to the jury what a picture of a bullet leaving a gun would look like. Is that right?
Right, it's called microflash, and what it is it's kind of like, you know, a flash that you have on your camera, and only this flash is very, very quick. And so when you could take photographs of things like moving through the air, bullets going through the air, 2,000, 3,000 feet per second. You can just kind of freeze them when the flash goes off.
So would you take a moment, please, and explain to the jury the mechanics of what happens when a bullet is fired from a gun, in terms of what comes out of the gun and when?
Okay. The firing pin hits the primer in the cartridge case. The primer detonates and sends a jet of flame through either one or two holes in the primer into the main body of the cartridge case, igniting the gunpowder. The gunpowder then begins to burn. It doesn't explode, it burns. And it's converted to gas. And then the pressure will be gradually to build up. Now, at the front of the cartridge case, you have the bullet, and that's kind of fixed in. So the pressure then begins to push against the bullet, to push it out of the cartridge case into the barrel, and then to be gripped by the rifling of the barrel. And it takes a while. It has to build up. Now, during this time, some gas will get around the bullet and will actually get in front of it. So now what you have is you have some of this gas in front of the bullet, then you have the bullet, and then you have the bulk of the gas. Now, the barrel of the gun, of course, is filled with air. And as the bullet goes down the barrel, it pushes the gas ahead of it, and it pushes the air. It's kind of like, you know, a hydraulic system. So it pushes it out. So what happens is the first thing you get out of the gun, if you do microflash, you'll see it, you'll get a little cloud of gas, not very big, and then pretty soon after that, you get the bulk of the gas. It looks like a mushroom lying on its side, okay? And in that big gas cloud, there'll be a bullet, and there'll be unburnt or burning grains of powder. So it's gas, bullet, big gas cloud with powder grains, all coming out in that order.
Can the gas that comes out first, is that that's part of the firing process, combined, the burning material combined with the air that's in the barrel?
Well, it will to a certain degree, but that's mostly the larger cloud of gas. What happens is it's kind of like you have a column of gas and air being pushed straight ahead. So if you hold the gun against, say, like clothing, what happens is this column of gas and air tears a hole through the clothing. And then the bullet gets to the clothing, and then the gas with the soot gets to the clothing as well as the powder. And so that material, if it's in contact, all the thing after the hole is made goes through the hole and comes out the other side.
If I heard you correctly then, if the muzzle of the gun is against clothing, there will be a hole made in the clothing by the gas first.
And the air, right.
in the air, followed by the bullet, and then followed by the soot or the burning powder behind it?
Right. And that's why blanks, people think blank cartridges are dangerous, are not dangerous. You can kill yourself with them. If you take a gun with a blank cartridge and put it against your chest, the gas formed will just tear right through your skin and muscle into your lung. And people, kid around and they'll put it to their head, they're going to die. It goes right in. You don't need the bullet to kill you with contact wounds.
Let's continue, though, with some of your experience and some of your writings. Have you written any articles about head trauma in particular?
Yes, I wrote one peer-reviewed article, and then I've written a chapter in my book on forensic pathology on head injuries.
Head injuries meaning such thing as blunt force trauma to the head?
Right.
I think you mentioned that you also have served as an editor of peer-reviewed scientific journals.
Yes, I'm the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology.
Does that work include whether or not to accept a submission by a researcher for publication?
Yes, I have the final say. I receive the articles, they go out to reviewers, their reports come back to me, and then I read the reviews and decide whether to publish or not.
Let's talk about work that you may have done specifically for entities outside the Bexar County Medical Examiner. With reference to your expertise in firearms injuries particularly, have you done work for the United States government?
Yes, I think about two years ago, I testified for the U.S. Attorney's Office in some incidents in New Orleans during the Hurricane Katrina, where police officers shot and wounded a number of people and killed one person. And I testified for the U.S. Department of Justice in that case. And I've done like one or two other cases and such.
Have you done any work for the United States Marines?
War crimes, I testified for Marine Corps in the prosecution of individual charged with war crimes.
How about for the British government?
Pardon?
For the British government?
The Bloody Sunday massacre that happened in Belfast years and years ago. And I have another case going in about another 2 months in Britain having to do with actually concussion, head injury, yes.
As well, the United Nations?
Yes, Yugoslavia war crimes, reviewed the reports, the autopsies to determine whether they are valid or not.
And let's talk briefly about some of the jurisdictions in which you've testified as an expert in forensic pathology.
I testified in most states in the Union, state courts, federal courts. Testified in Canada, Colombia, South America, by video. I was able to testify by the computer and everything. Let's see, South Africa, Israel.
I don't believe we've touched upon, and that's in the United States, in both state and federal courts?
Yes, sir.
Have you received some professional awards as well?
Yes, sir, from my medical school gave me the Master Teacher Award, and then I got some Outstanding Service Awards from the National Association of Medical Examiners, the Milton Halpern Award from the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and the Milton Halpern Laureate Award from the National Association of Medical Examiners.
Dr. DeMaio, is your professional background and your peer-reviewed articles, your books, and awards detailed with more specificity in your curriculum vitae?
Yes, they are.
I would like to approach the witness, please.
You may do so.
Yes, this evening. I'm handing you what's marked as Defendant's MM. If you take a look at it, please.
Yes, sir.
Is that your curriculum vitae?
Yes, sir, it is.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would offer then Defendant's MM as Defendant's next exhibit.
Any objections?
Objection, I'll approach the bench.
Yes, you may.